The clock in Blackwood Hall had just struck 10 when the argument began. "Impossible," muttered Professor Whitlock, adjusting his spectacles for the third time. "Your father's riddle makes no sense, Your Grace. Not even Cambridge's finest logic can untangle it." Duke Theodore Blackwood said nothing. He simply watched the parchment on the table, the one his father had left behind before his death 6 months ago, along with a single instruction scrawled in his own hand. "Only the worthy shall find what I have hidden." 9 scholars sat around that table now, men summoned from Oxford, from Cambridge, from the Royal Society itself, men with letters after their names and pride swelling their chests, and not one of them could make sense of the strange verse written in faded ink. "Where oak has stood since ancient days, and carried secrets no man says, look not upon the words you read, but where the branches learnt to bleed." Theodore rubbed his temples. His father, the late Duke, had always been a peculiar man, kind to servants, distant with nobility, forever wandering the estate with a small leather notebook. Everyone assumed grief had finally caught up with him before he passed. Now, Theodore wondered if there had been method behind the madness. "Perhaps it refers to a forest," offered Sir Alistair Penrose, stroking his greying whiskers. "Sherwood, perhaps, or—" "There is no forest mentioned in the deed," snapped another scholar. "This is a waste of my time. I have a lecture to prepare in Cambridge by Thursday." The room buzzed with frustrated whispers, teacups clinking against saucers as footmen moved quietly along the walls, refilling cups nobody was drinking from. Among them stood a young woman in a plain grey dress and white apron, her dark hair pinned back neatly beneath a servant's cap. Clara Bennet had worked in Blackwood Hall for nearly 4 years, ever since her mother's death left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination not to starve. She was not meant to listen. Servants rarely were. But as she poured tea for the red-faced Professor Whitlock, her eyes drifted, almost by accident, to the great carved mantelpiece above the fireplace, the one that had stood in that very room since the hall was built nearly 2 centuries before. Oak, dark with age, carved with twisting branches that climbed toward a crest of ivy and thorn. She paused mid-pour. The branches on the mantel were not simply decorative. They twisted in a peculiar pattern, almost like letters, almost like— "Miss?" Theodore's voice cut through her thoughts. She startled, nearly spilling the tea across the table. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, lowering her eyes. "I did not mean to—" "You were staring at something," he said. It was not an accusation. If anything, his voice carried curiosity, which surprised her more than his words. "What was it?" The scholars turned to look at her now, some amused, others irritated at the interruption. A maid, staring at a puzzle meant for the finest minds in England. Ridiculous. Clara's hands trembled slightly around the teapot, but something inside her, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps simple honesty, refused to let the moment pass. "The verse speaks of oak that has stood since ancient days," she said quietly, "and of branches that bleed. But oak does not bleed, sir, not unless something is carved into it." Professor Whitlock scoffed. "We are aware trees do not bleed, girl." "I do not mean it as poetry," Clara continued, ignoring the sting in his tone. "I mean it as instruction. Look at the mantel above the hearth. The branches carved there are not simply ornamental. Count them from the left. They do not match one another. Some curve twice, some only once." A heavy silence fell over the room. Theodore rose from his chair and walked to the fireplace, studying the ancient carving as though seeing it for the first time in his life, despite having grown up beneath it. He tilted his head, tracing the wooden branches with his fingers. "By God," he whispered, "it is a cipher." The scholars rushed forward, nearly toppling their chairs in the process, squinting and murmuring as they examined the carving Clara had noticed within the span of a single minute, something none of them had considered in 6 hours of quarreling. Sir Alistair turned to her, bewildered. "How did you see this? None of us—" I dust that mantle every morning, Clara said simply. One learns to notice small things when one spends enough time looking at them. Theodore stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Not merely surprise, but a flicker of admiration he did not quite understand yet. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara Bennett, Your Grace." He looked back at the mantle, then at the parchment, then at her again. "Miss Bennett," he said slowly, "I believe you have just done what 9 of England's finest scholars could not." The room erupted into murmurs of disbelief and quiet outrage. A maid correcting Oxford and Cambridge in the same breath. But Theodore was no longer listening to their protests. He was thinking, instead, of his father's final words before his passing, a whisper Theodore had dismissed as delirium at the time. "Find someone who looks where others refuse to. That is who deserves it all." For the first time since his father's death, Theodore felt the puzzle was no longer simply about hidden treasure. It was about something far more dangerous and far more personal. News travels quickly through a great house, and by the following morning, all of Blackwood Hall knew what had happened in the drawing room. The scholars had scattered back to their colleges in a huff, muttering about the indignity of being outwitted by a servant girl. Only 2 remained behind, too curious to leave before the second clue was found. The carved branches on the mantle, once decoded, had revealed a short line etched beneath the wooden pattern, nearly invisible to the naked eye. "Seek where the minster's shadow falls at noon." "York," Theodore said, studying the words for the 3rd time that morning. "It can only mean York Minster." His steward, a stern man named Mr. Pratt, who had served the family for 30 years, did not approve of what came next. "Your Grace, surely you do not intend to bring the girl along," he said, his voice low but firm as they stood in the entrance hall. "It is neither proper nor wise. What will people say?" "They will say what they always say," Theodore replied, pulling on his gloves. "That I have done something unconventional. I have survived worse gossip, Pratt." "She is a maid, sir." "She is the only person in this house who has solved anything," Theodore said simply, and that ended the conversation, though Pratt's disapproval lingered in the stiffness of his shoulders as he watched the carriage being prepared. Clara herself had not expected to be asked. When the housekeeper informed her that the Duke wished her to accompany him to York, she nearly dropped the linen she was folding. "Me, ma'am? Surely there has been some mistake." "No mistake," the housekeeper said, though her expression suggested she found the whole affair as improper as Pratt did. "You are to be ready within the hour. And, Clara, do try to remember your place, whatever His Grace intends." Remember her place, as though she could forget it, even for a moment. The carriage set off from Blackwood Hall shortly after 10, rattling along the Great North Road beneath a pale September sky. Clara sat stiffly at first, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the passing hedgerows rather than the man seated across from her. It felt strange beyond words, sharing a carriage with a duke as though she were a lady of quality rather than someone who scrubbed his floors. Theodore, for his part, seemed equally uncertain how to begin, though for entirely different reasons. He was unused to silence, sitting so heavily between 2 people.
"You needn't be so rigid, Miss Bennet," he said eventually as the carriage rolled through a small market town. "I do not bite."
"Forgive me, Your Grace. I have simply never travelled by carriage before, not one so fine, at least."
"Then perhaps you might look out the window instead of at your own hands," he said, and there was gentle humor in it, not mockery. She did, and found herself surprised by how much there was to see. Farmers driving carts loaded with autumn grain, children chasing hoops down cobbled lanes, a blacksmith's forge glowing orange even in daylight. Clara had spent her whole life within the walls of great houses, first as a scullery maid, then in service at Blackwood Hall. She had rarely seen the wider world beyond servants' quarters and kitchen gardens. They stopped near midday at a coaching inn called the Golden Fleece, where the horses were changed and travellers gathered for a hot meal. Theodore insisted Clara sit with him at the table rather than eat separately with the coachman, a decision that drew curious glances from the innkeeper and other guests. "You needn't trouble yourself on my account," she said quietly, uncomfortable beneath the stares. "I am not troubling myself," he replied. "I am simply eating my dinner. If others find that troubling, that is their concern, not mine." Over mutton pie and small ale, Theodore found himself asking questions he had not planned to ask. About her childhood, her mother, how she had come to service at such a young age. Clara answered carefully at first, unused to a nobleman showing genuine interest in her history rather than polite indifference. But something in his manner, patient and unhurried, coaxed honesty from her. "My mother died of fever when I was 14, she said. "There was no one else. Service was the only path left to me that did not end in the workhouse." Theodore said nothing for a long moment, turning his tankard slowly between his fingers. "My father used to say that circumstance shapes a person's beginning," he said finally, "but character shapes everything after. I begin to understand what he meant." Clara looked up, uncertain how to respond to such words from a duke. They continued on toward York as afternoon faded into evening, passing through smaller villages where church bells rang for evensong and lamplighters began their rounds along the high streets. Clara found herself watching Theodore more than the scenery now, noticing the quiet thoughtfulness in his expression, so unlike the cold, distant nobility she had always imagined dukes to possess. By the time York's ancient walls rose into view beneath a darkening sky, something unspoken had shifted between them. Not quite friendship, not yet anything more, but no longer the rigid distance of master and servant either. Theodore watched her lean toward the carriage window, eyes wide at her first glimpse of the minster's towers piercing the twilight, and felt a peculiar warmth settle in his chest, one he could not yet name, though he suspected, uneasily, that it would not fade quickly. York had given them the third clue, discovered at last beneath the minster's great sundial, where a groundskeeper recalled the old duke visiting years before to sketch the stonework. Carved faintly into the base of the dial, worn by decades of rain, were the words, "What Bodley guards, only humble eyes shall see." "The Bodleian," Theodore said, staring at the inscription. "My father spent a season there once, cataloguing manuscripts for a friend of his, a fellow of Merton College. I remember him speaking of it fondly." And so they travelled south, toward Oxford, where the golden stone of ancient colleges rose against a grey October sky, and where Clara would learn just how narrow some minds could be, however great their learning. The Bodleian Library was a place of hushed reverence, its high shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and centuries. Theodore had written ahead to secure permission for their visit, and a young don named Mr. Everley greeted them at the entrance with the stiff formality expected of Oxford men. "Your Grace, it is an honour," Mr. Everley said, bowing slightly. Then his eyes fell on Clara, standing a step behind Theodore in her plain travelling dress, and his expression shifted, ever so slightly, into something colder. "And your companion is—" "Miss Bennet assists me," Theodore said simply. "She will require access to the same collections I do." Mr. Everley's smile did not falter, but his eyes told a different story. "Of course, Your Grace. Though I should mention, the reading rooms are typically reserved for scholars and gentlemen. Perhaps the young woman might wait in the corridor." "She will not," Theodore said, his voice quiet but final. "Miss Bennet is the reason we stand here at all. I trust that will not be a difficulty." It was, clearly, though Mr. Everley said nothing further on the matter. Inside, Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as she followed Theodore through the narrow aisles between shelves. Scholars in dark robes glanced up from their reading, whispering behind gloved hands. A maid walking freely through the Bodleians' sacred halls as though she belonged there. The very notion seemed to offend some deep, unspoken order they had all agreed upon without ever saying it aloud. One elderly scholar, a man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, stopped them directly. "Forgive my boldness, Your Grace, but is this appropriate? The girl cannot possibly read Latin, let alone assist with manuscripts of this delicacy." "I can read Latin, sir," Clara said quietly, before Theodore could answer. "My mother once worked for a vicar's family before service in great houses. He taught me my letters, and more besides, out of kindness." The scholar blinked, clearly unprepared for a response, let alone one so composed. He said nothing further, though his expression remained skeptical as he walked away. They spent hours searching the collections mentioned in the old Duke's private letters, kept in a locked cabinet Mr. Everley reluctantly unlocked. Illuminated manuscripts, their pages gilded with gold leaf and painted borders of vines and small creatures, lay spread across the reading table beneath careful candlelight, for the library forbade anything brighter near such treasures. It was Clara who noticed it first, as she so often seemed to. Turning the fragile pages of an old bestiary, she paused on an illustration of an oak tree, its branches curling in a pattern hauntingly similar to the mantel carving in Blackwood Hall. "Your Grace," she whispered, "look here." Theodore leaned close, and together they studied the illumination. Hidden within the gold leaf border, so subtly worked into the design that it seemed mere decoration, were faint markings, letters disguised as flourishes. "It is the old Duke's hand," Theodore murmured. He recognized the particular slant of certain letters from his father's private notebooks. He hid something here himself, years before his death. Carefully, Clara traced the hidden words with her fingertip, careful never to touch the ancient page itself. Slowly, letter by letter, a message emerged. "Where humble hands once built for humble hearts, the next truth waits." Mr. Everley, watching from a respectful distance, could not hide his astonishment. How did she see what none of us noticed in years of study? Theodore looked toward Clara, something like quiet pride settling over his features. "Because she looks without assuming what she will find, Mr. Everley. Perhaps scholarship might benefit from a little more humility." That evening, as they walked briefly along the riverbank before returning to their lodgings, Clara remained troubled by the day's events. "They looked at me as though I did not belong within those walls," she said softly. "You belonged there more than any of them," Theodore replied.
"Knowledge does not care for titles, Miss Bennet, whatever Oxford believes of itself."
Clara said nothing, though something in his words settled deep within her, warm and unfamiliar, like the first true kindness she had known in years. Neither of them noticed the carriage that had followed them quietly from York, nor the sharp-eyed man watching from its shadowed window as they walked together beneath the lamplight. A distant cousin of Theodore's, the ambitious Marquess of Ashworth, who had heard whispers of a fortune hidden somewhere across England, and who did not intend to let a maid claim it before he did. York had given them the third clue, discovered at last beneath the minster's great sundial, where a groundskeeper recalled the old Duke visiting years before to sketch the stonework. Carved faintly into the base of the dial, worn by decades of rain, were the words, "What Bodley guards, only humble eyes shall see." "The Bodleian," Theodore said, staring at the inscription. "My father spent a season there once, cataloguing manuscripts for a friend of his, a fellow of Merton College. I remember him speaking of it fondly." And so they travelled south, toward Oxford, where the golden stone of ancient colleges rose against a grey October sky, and where Clara would learn just how narrow some minds could be, however great their learning. The Bodleian Library was a place of hushed reverence, its high shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and centuries. Theodore had written ahead to secure permission for their visit, and a young don named Mr. Everley greeted them at the entrance with the stiff formality expected of Oxford men. "Your Grace, it is an honour," Mr. Everley said, bowing slightly. Then his eyes fell on Clara, standing a step behind Theodore in her plain travelling dress, and his expression shifted, ever so slightly, into something colder. "And your companion is—" "Miss Bennet assists me," Theodore said simply. "She will require access to the same collections I do." Mr. Everley's smile did not falter, but his eyes told a different story. "Of course, Your Grace. Though I should mention, the reading rooms are typically reserved for scholars and gentlemen. Perhaps the young woman might wait in the corridor." "She will not," Theodore said, his voice quiet but final. "Miss Bennet is the reason we stand here at all. I trust that will not be a difficulty." It was, clearly, though Mr. Everley said nothing further on the matter. Inside, Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as she followed Theodore through the narrow aisles between shelves. Scholars in dark robes glanced up from their reading, whispering behind gloved hands. A maid, walking freely through the Bodleian sacred halls, as though she belonged there. The very notion seemed to offend some deep, unspoken order they had all agreed upon without ever saying it aloud. One elderly scholar, a man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, stopped them directly. "Forgive my boldness, Your Grace, but is this appropriate? The girl cannot possibly read Latin, let alone assist with manuscripts of this delicacy." "I can read Latin, sir," Clara said quietly, before Theodore could answer. "My mother once worked for a vicar's family before service in great houses. He taught me my letters, and more besides, out of kindness." The scholar blinked, clearly unprepared for a response, let alone one so composed. He said nothing further, though his expression remained skeptical as he walked away. They spent hours searching the collections mentioned in the old Duke's private letters, kept in a locked cabinet Mr. Everley reluctantly unlocked. Illuminated manuscripts, their pages gilded with gold leaf and painted borders of vines and small creatures, lay spread across the reading table beneath careful candlelight, for the library forbade anything brighter near such treasures. It was Clara who noticed it first, as she so often seemed to. Turning the fragile pages of an old bestiary, she paused on an illustration of an oak tree, its branches curling in a pattern hauntingly similar to the mantel carving in Blackwood Hall. "Your Grace," she whispered, "look here." Theodore leaned close, and together they studied the illumination. Hidden within the gold leaf border, so subtly worked into the design that it seemed mere decoration, were faint markings, letters disguised as flourishes. "It is the old Duke's hand," Theodore murmured. He recognized the particular slant of certain letters from his father's private notebooks. "He hid something here himself, years before his death." Carefully, Clara traced the hidden words with her fingertip, careful never to touch the ancient page itself. Slowly, letter by letter, a message emerged. "Where humble hands once built for humble hearts, the next truth waits." Mr. Everley, watching from a respectful distance, could not hide his astonishment. How did she see what none of us noticed in years of study? Theodore looked toward Clara, something like quiet pride settling over his features. "Because she looks without assuming what she will find, Mr. Everley. Perhaps scholarship might benefit from a little more humility." That evening, as they walked briefly along the riverbank before returning to their lodgings, Clara remained troubled by the day's events. "They looked at me as though I did not belong within those walls," she said softly. "You belonged there more than any of them," Theodore replied. "Knowledge does not care for titles, Miss Bennet, whatever Oxford believes of itself." Clara said nothing, though something in his words settled deep within her, warm and unfamiliar, like the first true kindness she had known in years. Neither of them noticed the carriage that had followed them quietly from York, nor the sharp-eyed man watching from its shadowed window as they walked together beneath the lamplight. A distant cousin of Theodore's, the ambitious Marquis of Ashworth, who had heard whispers of a fortune hidden somewhere across England, and who did not intend to let a maid claim it before he did. Ripon would have to wait. The clue pointed there plainly enough, but Theodore's London townhouse required his presence first, a matter of unavoidable estate business that could not be postponed, and so they travelled to Mayfair in the first week of November, arriving in the midst of the season's last great flourish before winter settled over the capital. Clara had never seen anything like it. Grand houses stood shoulder to shoulder along wide streets, their windows glowing with candlelight, carriages queuing outside for balls and suppers that seemed to stretch on nightly without end. The townhouse itself, though smaller than Blackwood Hall, was grander than anything she had imagined, all marble floors and gilt mirrors that reflected her plain reflection back at her from every angle, as though reminding her precisely how out of place she was. "You will attend the Fentons' ball with me on Thursday," Theodore informed her one afternoon, as though the matter required no discussion. Clara nearly dropped the book she had been dusting. "Your Grace, surely you cannot mean that. A servant at a ball?" "Not as a servant," he said, "as my guest. Lady Fenton's late husband was a great admirer of my father's charitable works. I suspect this puzzle may lead us to her household eventually, given how closely their families were entangled. Besides," he added, more quietly, "I find I no longer wish to hide your part in this from society, whatever they might say of it." What society said, predictably, was a great deal. The ball itself glittered with the particular brilliance of the London season at its height, chandeliers blazing above a sea of silk and jewels, an orchestra playing in the far corner, while dukes and earls and their ladies moved through the steps of the quadrille with practiced grace. Clara wore a gown Theodore had insisted on providing, pale blue silk that felt foreign against skin accustomed only to rough wool and cotton, and she felt every eye in the room upon her the moment she entered on his arm. "Who is that creature?" she overheard one lady whisper behind a painted fan, not quite quietly enough. "Surely not a lady of any breeding. Look at her hands." "I hear she was his maid," another voice answered, dripping with delighted scandal. "Imagine bringing such a person into society. Poor Blackwood must have lost his senses entirely." Clara kept her chin high, though the words stung more than she cared to admit, each whisper a small blade finding its mark despite her efforts to remain composed. Theodore, sensing her discomfort, kept close beside her throughout the evening, though even his presence could not entirely shield her from the cruelty dressed in silk and pearls that surrounded them. It was during a lull in the dancing that Lady Fenton herself, a sharp-eyed widow with silver hair and a reputation for bluntness, approached them near the great portrait gallery lining the ballroom's east wall. "Your Grace," she said, "I understand you seek something connected to my late husband's friendship with your father." "We believe so, Lady Fenton," Theodore replied, "though we are uncertain precisely what form it takes." Lady Fenton gestured toward a large portrait hanging above the gallery's marble fireplace, depicting her late husband alongside Theodore's father, both younger men standing before an oak tree remarkably similar to the one carved at Blackwood Hall. "They commissioned this together," she said, "though I never understood why. My husband always said the artist hid something within it, some private joke between old friends. I assumed it mere fancy." Clara stepped closer, studying the painting's background with quiet intensity, while several guests gathered nearby, curious despite themselves. Within the painted branches of the oak tree behind the two men, she noticed the same twisting pattern, disguised so cleverly within the brushwork that only careful eyes would ever find it. "Here," she said softly, tracing the shapes without touching the canvas. "The pattern matches the mantel at Blackwood Hall exactly." Working quickly, ignoring the murmurs rising around her, Clara deciphered the hidden message within minutes, faster than she had managed even in Oxford's library, while a small crowd of London's finest watched in stunned silence. Ripon's church holds what no fortune can replace, she read aloud. A gasp rippled through the gathered guests, not merely at the message itself, but at the sight of a maid solving in moments what none of society's most educated gentlemen had thought to attempt. Impossible, muttered one gentleman. The girl must have been told the answer beforehand. Surely this is some manner of trick. It is no trick, Theodore said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden hush of the ballroom. Miss Bennet has solved every clue of my father's puzzle since the very first morning, while scholars from Oxford and Cambridge failed entirely. I will not have her honesty questioned by men who cannot match her wit. The room fell utterly silent, save for the distant strains of the orchestra, still playing on, unaware of the scandal unfolding beneath the painted ceiling. Lady Fenton, to her credit, merely smiled, quiet approval in her sharp eyes. "Well," she said, "it seems the season has finally produced something worth talking about." By morning, the whole of London society buzzed with the tale, some scandalized, some delighted, all of them speaking of the Duke who had defended a maid's honor before the whole of the aristocracy, unaware that far more dangerous eyes had been watching from the shadowed edge of the gallery, calculating precisely how much time remained before Ripon's secret could be claimed by someone else entirely. They left London within the week, the scandal still trailing behind them like smoke from a doused fire, and travelled north once more toward Yorkshire, though not directly to Ripon as the clue suggested. A letter waiting at the townhouse, sent by the old vicar of Ripon in response to Theodore's earlier inquiry, mentioned that the church records referenced a strange arrangement made decades before between the old Duke and the monk's descendants who once tended Fountains Abbey, a detail that could not be ignored. "Fountains Abbey has stood in ruins since the old king's time," Theodore explained as their carriage rattled along roads growing rougher the further north they travelled. "My father visited often as a young man, before his marriage. I remember him sketching the ruins for hours when I was a boy." Clara had heard of the Abbey, though she had never imagined seeing it herself, a great monastery reduced to broken arches and empty windows after centuries of neglect, its stones slowly surrendering to ivy and moss. When they arrived on a cold, grey afternoon, mist clinging low to the valley floor, she understood at once why the place had captured the old Duke's imagination. There was something solemn and beautiful in the ruin, as though the past still breathed quietly within its crumbling walls. They had barely begun their search among the Abbey's ancient stones, comparing carvings along the cloister walls to the pattern they now knew so well, when a voice called out from behind a broken archway, "Your Grace, how fortunate to find you here." Theodore turned sharply, recognizing his cousin's voice before he saw his face. The Marquis of Ashworth emerged from the shadows, dressed for travel, his expression carrying none of the polite warmth he usually reserved for family gatherings. "Ashworth," Theodore said, wary immediately. "What brings you to Fountains Abbey?" "The same thing that brings you, cousin," the Marquis replied smoothly. "Though I confess, I did not expect to find your maid quite so instrumental in the search. Tell me, does she share in the inheritance too, should you find it?" "That is none of your concern," Theodore said, his voice hardening. The Marquis smiled thinly. "Perhaps not, though I wonder whether your father intended his fortune to secure schools and almshouses, or whether some portion might rightfully belong to family, rather than strangers dressed above their station." Before Theodore could respond, the Marquis's hand moved quickly, snatching a folded paper from the satchel Theodore carried, the one containing his father's private letters and the last decoded fragments of the puzzle. "Ashworth!" Theodore lunged forward, but the Marquis had already retreated toward the Abbey's outer wall, tucking the stolen paper inside his coat. "Consider this fair compensation for years of being overlooked," he called back. "I shall see myself to Ripon, cousin. Perhaps I shall arrive first this time." He disappeared through a gap in the ruined wall, and moments later, The distant sound of hoofbeats confirmed he had fled entirely, leaving Theodore and Clara alone amid the darkening ruins as the afternoon light began rapidly fading toward evening. "He has taken the final directions," Theodore said grimly, searching through what remained in his satchel. "Without them, we cannot be certain which part of Ripon's church holds the answer." "Then we must remember what we already know," Clara said firmly, refusing to surrender to panic. The message spoke of what no fortune could replace. Perhaps it is not written directions we require, but simply careful thought. They pressed onward through the ruins as daylight failed almost entirely, the mist thickening around broken archways until the Abbey seemed to close in around them like something alive. It was Clara who noticed, carved faintly into a fallen stone near the old chapter house, symbols matching those from Blackwood Hall's mantle, weathered nearly to invisibility, but still present for eyes willing to look closely enough. "Here," she whispered, kneeling beside the stone despite the cold dampness soaking through her skirts. "The pattern continues. I believe it points toward the crypt beneath the church, Your Grace, not the church itself." Together, working quickly in the fading light, they pieced together enough of the remaining clue to feel confident in their conclusion, though full darkness had fallen by the time they finished, and finding their way back through the ruined Abbey grounds proved considerably more difficult than their arrival had been. They reached a small coaching inn near Ripon well past nightfall, exhausted, cold, and thoroughly relieved to find warm firelight and simple food waiting within. Sitting together near the hearth afterward, wrapped in blankets provided by the innkeeper's wife, neither spoke for a long while, the events of the day settling slowly around them like the Abbey's mist. "You did not panic," Theodore said finally, watching firelight play across her tired features. "Even when Ashworth stole the paper, even lost within those ruins in the dark. I confess, I very nearly did." "Panic solves nothing," Clara said simply. "I learned that lesson young, Your Grace." Theodore studied her a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, quiet and certain, as though a truth he had been circling for weeks had finally settled fully into place. "I believe," he said slowly, "that what I feel for you, Miss Bennet, has grown well beyond mere admiration." Clara's breath caught, uncertain how to answer such words from a man so far above her station, though something within her chest answered before her mind could argue otherwise. Outside, the wind howled softly against the inn's shuttered windows, and neither of them noticed, nor could have known, that the Marquis of Ashworth had already reached Ripon himself, standing at that very moment beneath the shadow of the ancient parish church, searching desperately for an answer he did not yet possess. Morning came gray and quiet over Ripon, frost silvering the cobblestones as Theodore and Clara made their way toward the parish church before the town had properly woken. They found Ashworth already there, pacing before the church door with the restless anger of a man who has searched all night and found nothing. "You," he snarled, spotting them approaching. "Where is the rest of it? I have searched every stone in this churchyard." "Perhaps," Theodore said coolly, "because you searched the wrong place entirely, cousin." They left him standing there, furious and unanswered, while the old vicar, roused by the commotion, allowed them access to the crypt beneath the church, a narrow stone chamber lit only by a single lantern and smelling faintly of damp earth and centuries of quiet rest. Along the far wall, carved into a memorial stone dedicated to a family long since forgotten, the familiar branching pattern appeared once more, though this time it did not lead to treasure. It led to a name. "Miss Agnes Whitcomb," Clara read aloud, tracing the worn letters. "Headmistress, Grassmere." Beneath it, another line. "She who understood him best shall understand you last." "Grassmere," Theodore murmured. "The Lake District. I know of no connection between my father and that place, though clearly one exists." They traveled the final distance over 3 days, the roads growing wilder and more beautiful the further they journeyed, until the great fells of Cumberland rose before them, grey stone and green bracken beneath low clouds that seemed to touch the mountaintops themselves. Clara had never seen country so dramatic, so entirely unlike the gentle Cotswolds or the ordered streets of London, and found herself strangely moved by its wildness. Grasmere itself proved a small village nestled beside a still lake, and inquiries at the local inn led them quickly to a modest stone building tucked behind the churchyard, bearing a weathered sign, Grasmere School for Girls of Humble Birth. The headmistress who greeted them was elderly now, silver-haired and slightly stooped, though her eyes remained sharp with an intelligence that had clearly not dimmed with age. "Miss Whitcomb?" Theodore asked. "I am. I know precisely who you are, Your Grace," she interrupted, a small smile touching her lips. "You have your father's eyes, and considerably more patience than he possessed at your age. Come in, both of you. I have waited a long while for this visit." Inside her small parlor, warmed by a crackling fire, Miss Whitcomb poured tea with steady hands and told them a story Theodore had never heard. "Your father and I were childhood friends," she explained, "long before he became Duke, when our families were neighbors in Westmoreland. I taught alongside my own mother in a village school then, and your father would often visit, more interested in watching them learn their letters than in any of the pursuits expected of a young gentleman of his standing." "Why did he never speak of you?" Theodore asked. "Because I refused his help for many years," Miss Whitcomb said simply. "I did not wish charity, only opportunity, and there is a considerable difference between the two, whatever society believes. Eventually, he understood that, and rather than simply funding my efforts, he asked what I truly needed. This school was built upon that understanding, not upon pity." Clara listened closely, recognizing something of her own circumstances in the headmistress's words, the fierce desire for opportunity rather than mere charity, for respect rather than condescension. "Your father designed this puzzle with great care, Your Grace," Miss Whitcomb continued, studying them both with knowing eyes. "He told me once, years before his final illness, that he intended to find someone whose heart understood true worth, someone who valued compassion over privilege, wisdom over titles. I confess, I wondered for years who such a person might prove to be." She looked pointedly at Clara as she spoke, and Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks under such direct scrutiny. "I do not understand," Theodore said slowly. "You believe my father intended this puzzle specifically to be solved by someone such as Miss Bennet?" "I believe," Miss Whitcomb said gently, "that your father understood scholars examine puzzles with their minds alone, while those who have known hardship examine them with both mind and heart. He wished his legacy to fall into hands capable of both, Your Grace. I begin to think he succeeded rather precisely in that aim." She rose slowly and retrieved a small, locked box from beneath a floorboard near the hearth, producing a final letter sealed with the old Duke's own signet, which she placed carefully into Theodore's hands. "He asked me to keep this until the puzzle's end was near," she said. "I believe that time has finally arrived." Theodore broke the seal with trembling fingers, unfolding a letter written in his father's familiar hand, and as he read the words silently, his expression shifted through surprise, sorrow, and finally, something like profound understanding, while Clara watched, uncertain what revelation awaited them both at journey's true end. The letter, once read aloud that evening by the fire in Miss Whitcomb's parlor, changed everything Theodore believed about his father's final wishes. "My dear son," it began, "if you are reading these words, then the puzzle has run its course, and I trust it has led you to someone whose worth cannot be measured by birth or fortune. I built no treasure for you to inherit, Theodore. I built a lesson, hidden across the places that shaped my understanding of true nobility. Whatever fortune remains attached to these clues, I intended it not for family alone, but for the schools, almshouses, and orphanages I have quietly supported these many years." Should you find someone worthy enough to complete this journey beside you, know that I would consider that person family before any title could confirm it." Theodore's hands trembled as he finished reading, and Clara, watching him carefully, said nothing, understanding instinctively that some grief required silence rather than comfort. They returned to Yorkshire within the week, though their arrival at Blackwood Hall proved far different from their quiet departure weeks before. Word had spread quickly, London gossip travelling faster than any carriage, and by the time they reached home, the Marquess of Ashworth had already lodged a formal complaint before the county magistrates, accusing Clara of deception, theft of family documents, and manipulating Theodore's affections for personal gain. "This is absurd," Theodore said furiously, reading the summons that awaited them. "He stole the paper from us, not the reverse." "Absurd or not," Mr. Pratt said gravely, "you must answer the accusation before the county court in York, Your Grace. Refusing would only confirm suspicion in the eyes of those already inclined to believe the worst of Miss Bennet." The court convened 3 days later in York's Grand Assembly Rooms, packed with curious onlookers eager to witness the scandal that had consumed London's drawing rooms and Yorkshire's parlours alike. Clara stood pale but composed before the assembled magistrates, Theodore beside her, while the Marquis presented his case with practised confidence. "This woman," Ashworth declared, gesturing dismissively toward Clara, "has manipulated my cousin's grief and loneliness following his father's death, positioning herself cleverly at each stage of this puzzle to claim a fortune rightfully belonging to family. I submit that her sudden and remarkable ability to solve these riddles suggests prior knowledge, obtained through means we can only guess at." A murmur rippled through the assembly rooms, and Clara felt the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes pressing upon her once more, though this time far more consequential than mere ballroom gossip. It was then that the doors at the rear of the chamber opened, and a procession began that no one had expected. Old Mr. Hargreave from Ashcombe entered first, leaning heavily on his cane, followed by Miss Turner, the schoolmistress. Behind them came Mr. Everley from Oxford, considerably humbled since their last meeting, and even Lady Fenton herself, resplendent in silk despite the early hour. Last of all came Miss Whitcomb, travelling the considerable distance from Grasmere despite her age, supported by a young footman Theodore had sent to fetch her. "Your honours," Theodore said, rising to address the magistrates directly. "I have brought witnesses from every stage of this journey, each capable of testifying that Miss Bennet solved these puzzles through genuine insight, not deception." One by one, they spoke. Mr. Hargreave described how villagers themselves had watched Clara decipher the schoolhouse carving. Miss Turner confirmed the timeline precisely. Mr. Everley, visibly uncomfortable, nonetheless admitted honestly that Clara had read Latin manuscripts he himself had struggled with for years. Lady Fenton spoke of the ballroom portrait, of dozens of witnesses who had watched Clara solve the clue within minutes before an audience of London's finest. Finally, Miss Whitcomb rose, her voice frail but carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "I knew the late Duke personally," she said, "for over 40 years. He designed this puzzle himself, long before his death, specifically to identify someone of genuine compassion and intelligence, regardless of birth. I possess a letter written in his own hand confirming precisely this intention." She produced the letter Theodore had shown no one else, its seal already broken, and handed it to the presiding magistrate for examination. The Marquis's confident expression faltered as the magistrate read the letter aloud, the old Duke's own words confirming everything the witnesses had already testified. "It appears," the magistrate said finally, setting down the letter, "that this puzzle was designed with remarkable specificity, Lord Ashworth, and that Miss Bennet has fulfilled its purpose through honest merit rather than deception. Your accusations, I am afraid, are entirely without foundation." The chamber erupted into murmurs, some scandalized, many quietly delighted at witnessing pride so thoroughly humbled. Ashworth's face darkened with fury and embarrassment as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. Theodore stepped forward then, before the assembled crowd, taking Clara's hand in his own without hesitation, regardless of who watched or what they might say afterward. "I wish to declare, before this court and before all of Yorkshire," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "that every clue within my father's puzzle was solved through Clara Bennet's wisdom, courage, and compassion, qualities I have come to value far beyond any title or fortune. I will not abandon her, whatever society believes of the matter, for I have found in her something far more valuable than my father's hidden inheritance." Clara felt tears rise unbidden as gasps and whispers filled the chamber around them. Though for the first time since the puzzle began, she found she did not care what anyone thought at all, save for the man standing beside her, holding her hand before the whole of Yorkshire's assembled society. Winter had settled fully over Blackwood Hall by the time they returned, frost silvering the great oak that stood in the gardens behind the house, its branches bare now, but unmistakably the same tree carved into the mantle that had started everything months before. Theodore had known of this final tree for years, without ever understanding its significance, having played beneath its shade as a boy, without once suspecting his own father had planted it deliberately, its position marking the very last piece of the puzzle. "He planted it the year I was born," Theodore said, standing beneath the bare branches with Clara beside him, his father's final letter still folded carefully within his coat. "My mother told me once, though I never thought to ask why he chose this particular spot in the garden. They found the last of it buried at the tree's roots, a small iron box wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from decades of rain, containing not gold or jewels as the servants had whispered for months, but something far more consequential. Deeds and legal documents securing charitable trusts across 4 counties, schools in the Cotswolds and Grasmere, almshouses in York, an orphanage quietly established near London that none of them had even known existed until that morning. "There is no fortune here," Theodore said slowly, reading through the papers with growing understanding. "Beyond what he has already given away these many years. He left nothing hidden for himself, or for me, save the knowledge of what he had done." Clara stood quietly beside him, watching emotion move across his face, grief and admiration intertwined so completely that neither could be separated from the other. "Perhaps," she said gently, "that was always the true inheritance, Your Grace. Not wealth, but purpose." Theodore looked at her then, and something settled fully into place within him, a certainty that had been building steadily since that first morning in the drawing room when she had silenced 9 of England's finest scholars within the space of a single minute. "Marry me, Clara," he said simply, without ceremony or grand declaration, merely the quiet honesty that had grown between them across every mile of their strange, remarkable journey. "Not because society now expects it, nor because my father's puzzle led us here together. Marry me because I cannot imagine continuing this work, or any part of my life hereafter, without you standing beside me." Clara felt tears rise, though she laughed softly through them, overwhelmed by how entirely her circumstances had transformed since that first ordinary morning, serving tea to quarreling scholars. "I never imagined such a life for myself," she admitted. "A maid, marrying a duke. Nor did I imagine falling in love with the person who would teach me more about my own father, and about genuine worth, than any scholar or nobleman ever managed," Theodore replied. "Yet here we stand." There remained, however, one final matter neither of them expected. Old Mrs. Blackwood, Theodore's grandmother, a formidable woman who had said little throughout the entire scandal, requested a private audience with Clara before any wedding could proceed, and Clara approached the meeting with considerable trepidation, certain the old woman intended to voice the objections everyone else had already raised. Instead, the elderly dowager studied her for a long, silent moment before speaking. "My son," she said, referring to the late Duke, "wrote to me only weeks before his death, describing a young maid whose kindness and sharp mind had caught his attention during a brief visit to the house. He believed, even then, that circumstance had placed someone remarkable within our own walls, waiting only for someone wise enough to notice her. She paused, studying Clara's stunned expression carefully. I believe my grandson has finally proven himself wise enough. The wedding took place the following spring, not in London's fashionable churches where society might have expected such an event, but in the ancient parish church at Ripon, where their journey had so nearly ended in scandal and confusion months before. Villagers from Ashcombe traveled the considerable distance to attend, along with Miss Turner and her schoolchildren, Miss Whitcomb from Grasmere, and even Lady Fenton, who declared the whole affair the most sensible match London society had witnessed in a decade, whatever the gossips continued to whisper. The Marquis of Ashworth, disgraced thoroughly by the county court's ruling, did not attend, having retreated to the continent shortly afterward to avoid the considerable embarrassment his accusations had brought upon his own reputation. Theodore and Clara, now Duke and Duchess of Blackwood, dedicated themselves in the years that followed not to expanding their own fortune, but to preserving and extending the quiet legacy the old Duke had built across England. Schools flourishing in villages that might otherwise have faded into poverty, orphanages providing opportunities to children who would otherwise have known only hardship. Clara herself, remembering her own limited education, established a small school within Blackwood Hall's own grounds, teaching servants' children their letters in the very drawing room where she had once poured tea for scholars who believed her incapable of understanding anything beyond her station. Years later, visitors to Blackwood Hall would sometimes ask about the old oak mantel above the drawing room fireplace, its carved branches still visible to careful eyes, and the Duchess would smile, tracing the pattern gently with her fingertips, remembering a single ordinary morning when careful observation had changed the entire course of her life.
It taught me, she would say quietly, that true nobility has never depended upon birth, but upon the quiet courage to look closely at the world and the compassion to act on what one finds there. And in that answer, as much as in any inheritance her husband's father had left behind, lay the truest legacy of all.